We've talked about this before, where every year when the lectionary readings come up, we're in a different context as a nation, as a community, in our own lives, as a community of faith. There's any number of things going on that cause us to read the lessons a little differently. And you probably heard me read this gospel text today with some added intentionality as I moved through it. There is a word in this text that I think bears some attention. The word neighbor. Now, Pastor Friederike and I will often talk about words and where they come from because our Muttersprache, our mother tongue, is different from one another. And sometimes the words are similar and sometimes they are not. German has this great neighbor word, though, that's one of my favorite German words, Sitznachbar, which is your seat neighbor, the person sitting next to you, which I think is just a fun term. We should have something like that in English. But the idea of a neighbor, which in English you get back too far and you actually get very close to the German, it focuses on this idea of nearness, which is kind of what we imagine with neighbor. Our immediate thought is the person who lives in the home next to you, right? In German, you would say Nachbar, or often der Nächste, the next one. And that emphasizes that sense of proximity, right? The nearness. The one who doesn't go to the other side, but the one who went near, right? We hear that in the text today, this idea of nearness. As I was thinking of these with my 12-hour layover in Denver yesterday and additional bonus travel day, and was thinking about all of these different aspects, I was mindful of something that I have paid attention to more over the last couple of years, particularly as on Sundays I am more prone to walk to church early than I am to ride my bike here early. You may not be as familiar with the sidewalk surrounding Grace as I am, but the sidewalk on the street side is actually double wide. There's the sidewalk, and then the green space is also sidewalk. So it's sidewalk next to sidewalk, and then the road. This morning, I was walking at 6:45, slept in, and was walking along, and I saw a couple approaching me, and I was careful to stay on the landscaping side of things, so there were 2 full sidewalk spaces there, but it wasn't enough. And so they had to step out into the street, into that 3rd sidewalk space, I guess, to circle around me. They crossed to the other side, you might say. So I greeted them verbally, and they were quick to greet me in response as well. But this idea of not being able to share a sidewalk is certainly a consequence of the last 5 years that we have had. But it just is profoundly striking, this idea of nearness that is a part of this. Well, let's move through the story. We have a lawyer, and now in our minds we're immediately jumping to lawyers. And how does this work? It's not completely unrelated, but the law of Moses and how to live your life of faith is something that sometimes involved legal questions. So maybe you have acquired new animals at your home from extended family, and you're wondering how to care for them on the Sabbath because you haven't had maybe a cow before, and you need to know what the rules are because you're not supposed to be working. And so how does that work? Well, you might consult a lawyer, a legal expert in the law of Moses, to kind of help you sort that out. And so the lawyer comes to Jesus, and do you notice the approach? The lawyer doesn't have a question. He asks a question, but he's not there to ask a question. He is there to test Jesus. He wants to take him down 2 or 3 notches in public, in front of others. That's his goal. What must I do to earn my way into heaven? What must I do? What must I do? Now, we're well before any idea of St. Peter at the pearly gates, right? But the image is that you show up at the pearly gates, and St. Peter asks the name and starts looking down the list, and are you on it, right? That's the idea. And this worldview instead says, you don't need to look at the list. Allow me to provide you with my resume. That's where this is going. How have I earned this? What have we earned? Or maybe to say it a little differently, what do we deserve? Right? So Jesus, in classic rabbinical fashion, says, well, what do you think? We are to love God with our heart and mind and spirit and strength, and our neighbors, our near ones, as ourselves. And Jesus says, bingo, you got it. But who is my neighbor? Who is der Nächste? Who is the near one in my life? Who do I need to be caring for, right? Who do I need to be loving as myself? And so Jesus then says, I'm going to tell you a story. There are a number of characters in this story, right? There's the man who is beaten on the road. There is a priest. There is a Levite, which is kind of like a priest, but it starts with an L. Then there is a Samaritan. There's an innkeeper. I suppose if we really wanted to drill down, there's an animal in there. One thing that struck me, though, is that there's also robbers in this, which I think is worth saying out loud. For some reason, they feel like a more important part of the story today. So this man goes down this road. This road is known to be a bit dodgy. This man chose not to go with friends. He went it alone. Who knows why he did this? Clearly, he made a number of bad choices. What has he deserved? Well, if he was smarter, had studied martial arts for 50 years, this wouldn't have happened. He kind of had this coming, right? There are robbers who show up, who could have day jobs like teaching kindergarten or working at their local hospital, but instead they like to find vulnerable people and take and hurt. I just mentioned that out loud because our world has always had, and sadly often men in every generation, who go through their lives in ways that seek out the vulnerable to take and hurt. I think that's worth just saying. So this man is left half dead in the ditch, right? Now, the priest and the Levite walk by, and do you notice that they not only don't help, they cross to the other side, probably checking their text messages and kind of walking by, right? There is some school of thought that perhaps they couldn't assist, maybe getting blood on their hands in a way that would not allow them to do their ritual obligations for the sake of the people, that one might say perhaps that out of their obligation towards God, they could not help this man. Now, Jesus' point in this is you're misunderstanding what God is asking you to be about. Now, we get to the Samaritan, and we know the Samaritan's the good guy in the story, right? And culturally, we know that they were kind of, as my grandfather might say, the shirt-tail relatives of the Jewish people that practiced the faith and tradition and culture a little bit in ways that might have been seen as wrong, and they were other. And the Samaritan is the one who is moved with pity, has empathy for this man. I know in certain circles today that's seen as a personality defect, but Jesus lifts up the Samaritan and his pity towards this man as the hero of the story. And so he draws near, as the text says, setting up this discussion of neighbor. When I was thinking about neighbors, there is a t-shirt I saw that said, "What would Mr. Rogers do?" Right? In a world that feels like it's got a lot of, "This is Sparta," that the question of, what would Mr. Rogers do, is a good question for people of faith. You may not know, but Pastor Rogers was a rostered clergy person in the Presbyterian Church USA and had a long, we would say, ministry of education for children. But the show's name, right, is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The neighborhood. Who is the neighbor? And how does Mr. Rogers interact with the neighbors in the neighborhood? In ways that draw near. The classic example is him sharing the wading pool with the black actor in that set at a time where that was seen as not something you did. He drew near. Now, another thing that I think is interesting about the story today is there is a component of it where we might say it's kind of the opposites, right? So we have the people who are supposed to be the good guys not being the good guys, and we have the people who are supposed to be the bad guys not being the bad guys and in fact being the good guys. So we could paint this in different ways, right? It's the Ukrainian who assists the Russian, or it is the Palestinian who assists the Israeli, or the conservative who assists the liberal, or who knows what the case might be. But there's also an element of unexpectedness in the sense that the third person isn't the obvious choice, not just from a good person, bad person standpoint. Somebody gave a silly analogy. So you have been sidelined on your trek because you have a full, fabulous cup of coffee, but you are short cream and sugar. And the barista from Starbucks walks by and doesn't help. And the barista from Pete's walks by and doesn't help. But it's the person from O'Reilly's Auto Parts who stops and drops everything to go throughout the countryside and find cream and sugar for you. The Good Samaritan is not necessarily the person who is more skilled or capable or able. It is his empathy, his pity for this person, or perhaps the most critical skill, a willingness to come close. Now, this wasn't handy for him. I'm sure the Samaritan wasn't in the morning saying, "Honey, I'm going to go walk the road again in case anybody's been beaten up. You know, it's what he does on Saturdays." I don't know. I don't think that's the deal. He's got his first aid kit on his donkey. I don't think that's the thing. He had a plan to not do that. That was not what his plan was for the day. But he stopped and dropped everything to do that thing, to draw near. You heard me read it, and I have emphasized it in the sermon as well. But I want you today, particularly this year, to notice that language, that the priest and the Levite went to the other side. They passed by on the other side. The Samaritan drew near. Drew near. We're at a point in our world that has always been true to some extent, but is particularly true now, and I would argue exceptionally so following the pandemic, of being careful to keep certain distance, physically, socially, emotionally. And this parable challenges that idea. Now, this Samaritan doesn't just say, I've got some Band-Aids in my glove box, you can use my cell phone quick, good luck, buddy, heading off. No, he puts him on his own animal. This is added emphasis in the text. Puts him on his own animal, binds him up, takes him to an inn, cares for him. Do you notice how that phrase is very vague from a standpoint of time? Was that he was there an hour? He was there 2 days? It doesn't seem to indicate that at all. He gives the innkeeper 2 denarii. Ah, yes, 2 denarii, right? It's kind of the typical wage that a laborer would get for a day is 1 denarii. So 2 days of wages to the innkeeper. And then says, care for him. I will return and I will pay you whatever else you have spent. So Jesus says, so who was the neighbor to this man? The one who showed mercy. Now, on some level, did the man who was robbed get what he deserved? Did he meet all of the requirements for receiving assistance from the Samaritan? Do you notice how that's not even a part of the story? What was the requirement? Simply that he was in need. There's a lot going on with this text, and I don't know that I've necessarily sewed it all up for you, but I'm hoping you're hearing in the language of the text today some different things that are jogging in your mind. It's a complicated world, and it's amazing to me how this parable continues to speak. But if nothing else, hear this business about Christ's challenge to us to not cross over to the other side to go around, but rather to draw near. And not when it's convenient, clean, easy, or even necessarily safe. The Holy Spirit is not primarily concerned about our safety and security, but the idea that we are called to help the vulnerable and the broken, to draw near. Amen.